Welcome to another episode of The Watchdog. As you know, each week here on Mint Press, we are going against the grain, giving coverage to stories which are routinely ignored by the mainstream media. For that reason, we hope you will like, share, and subscribe off the back of this video. And we also hope that you will support us on Patreon if you can. This week, we are joined by the legendary philosopher, dissident, and linguist, Noam Chomsky. Noam, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Okay, happy to be with you.
So to start with, my understanding is that you've maintained a sharp separation between your linguistic and your political ideas. Why is that?
Well, one reason is because they're distinct. Another is, as a matter of principle, I don't think we should introduce, if I'm giving a lecture on linguistics, I don't think it's appropriate for me to subject the audience to my ideas about the political world. There are some kind of abstract connections. I've discussed them now and then, mainly about what we learn about fundamental human nature from the study of our most distinctive properties, what distinguishes humans from the rest of the animal world is basically language and thought, and the two are arguably identical. Language is the instrument for constructing thought. Thought is what we construct in language. So by looking at the nature of these systems, we can draw some, if not conclusions, at least hints about what the common good should be, what's good for human beings. And there is a history of doing this, going back to figures like Rousseau, Wilhelm von Humboldt, others, with some reason, I think.
Now, Julian Assange put it the following way. He said, "Privacy is gone. It will not come back short of a very regressive economic collapse, which would reduce the economic capacity of civilization." Now, when the ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, was being worked on and invented, as described by Yashir Levine in his book Surveillance Valley, there were actually occupations and protests at institutions like MIT. He really positions the internet as being invented for counterinsurgency purposes following US defeat in Vietnam. Now, as someone who has lived the majority of their life without the internet and wrote Manufacturing Consent before the internet existed, as far as I know, or at least before it existed in a public way, how do you think the invention of the internet has changed the ability of power to reproduce itself?
Well, the internet, as for surveillance, I presume that what we're now saying is being sent to Utah or wherever the NSA stores things, and probably to Israeli centers as well, maybe a couple others. But going back to, say, the 60s, there was no internet. We were involved, those of us who were involved in resistance activities did want to keep some things secret. We took for granted that the groups that we were working with were probably infiltrated. Just about every group was infiltrated. And you could usually tell who the infiltrators were if someone in the group was dressed up like a Hollywood version of a hippie and was yelling off the cops and so on. There was a fair chance you'd see him at a federal trial testifying for the prosecution. So you got kind of sensitized to this. When we were doing things that involved real human concerns, like helping a deserter get out of the country or something, we never did it in a group. we always did it with affinity groups, 2 or 3 people who knew each other and trusted each other, and we could work it out. So there was constant surveillance. Sometimes it was so overt it was almost a joke, but it was there. And now, of course, it's much more extreme. So yes, I think Assange is correct. There's basically no way to ensure privacy. Somebody can always be looking in. If the NSA could be reading Merkel's private email, then they can look at ours. Actually, I don't really feel it's that much of a problem. The fact is they are overwhelmed with data that they have nothing to do with. I've actually seen this come up in federal trials where I was a co-defendant. Now, the FBI had a ton of information about the defendants, which easily could have led to prosecution. They didn't use it because they didn't understand it. They didn't know what was going on. They were looking at things from their perspective, which is a distorting perspective, and they couldn't see what was actually happening. Actually, we saw this in the case of 9/11. There was a ton of information, but they just couldn't use it. You have to understand, it's kind of like science or politics or anything else. You're swamped with information. The talent is to pick out what matters. And that requires understanding, perception, which fortunately for us, the spooks don't have.
Do you view the internet as, in some ways, a double-edged sword in that there is use for building social movements, but at the same time, it is really adept at getting to the nooks and crannies of people's private lives, and it renders basically everything visible, and that there's a huge disparity between access to information between the powerful and those in society who are atomized? How do you view it? Do you view there as being use for social movements?
Well, first of all, we should be a little cautious about it. It's true, they have a ton more of information than we do, but that doesn't give them better access. You have to understand the information. You can have endless, and I know scholars, serious scholars, who know everything about a certain domain where they work in and who understand nothing about it. Okay. You have to, it's quite different to have information and to be able to access it. We all know this. You know, you're overwhelmed by data. Even without the internet, you're overwhelmed by data. But what matters is being able to see through it and see what's significant. As far as the social media are concerned, I should say, first of all, I don't use them myself. I think they're a disaster. But they are kind of double-edged. So take, say, Glasgow a couple of days ago. There were huge demonstrations in the streets, very important. The most important thing, the only important thing that happened at Glasgow. I'm pretty sure they were organized through social media. That's usually the way it's done. And it can be very effective. You can also reach people like we're doing right now, way out at the margins. But you can reach people which they're not going to get through the mainstream. So it has positive aspects. And it has a downside. One downside is what you mentioned. You're an open book to power systems that have the resources to look into what you're doing if they want to do it. But probably even worse than that is that the social media have had a tendency to drive people into self-reinforcing bubbles of common belief and understanding. So you tend to lose contact to what's happening outside your circle. We see that over and over. That's the way a lot of these weird conspiracy ideas develop. You just talk to people who share your beliefs. They reinforce them. Pretty soon you don't see anything else. And you collect huge amounts of, a lot of people collect enormous amounts of data, which are totally meaningless, which support whatever weird belief they have. Countries run by sadistic pedophiles who are involved in torturing children, about 25% of Republicans. If you're in those circles and that's what you read, and you find this little tidbit of data, that tidbit of data, you put them together, pretty soon you have a construction you can actually believe. We see a lot of that now, quite a lot, and it's very harmful. It's preventing the proper treatment of the pandemic. It's even much more serious than that. It's preventing efforts to deal with the truly existential crisis of global warming. Take the Trump years. Polls show that among Republicans during the Trump years, regarding global warming as a serious problem, declined by about 20%. And it's not just a serious problem, it's an urgent problem. Well, that's lethal for human survival. And if all you're doing is looking at Fox News and Breitbart and listening to Trump and his acolytes in Congress, that's what you'd believe.
It struck me with the conferences in Glasgow. We're in a situation where the US military pollutes more than 140 countries put together, but yet military emissions were not present in any of the negotiations. They were completely off the table. Do you think there's any way that without the involvement of emissions by the military, we can turn our fate away from the disaster that we are living through and headed towards an even worse one? Is that possible without the inclusion of military emissions?
It's a very serious problem. As you say, it's at the level of many medium-sized countries. Not only that, but the military greatly increases the threats to us, greatly increases them, and every strategic analyst knows that. So upgrading fixed position ICBMs, Minuteman, it's not a threat to anyone else. It's a threat to us. And it's well known and understood, and they continue to do it. These are fixed position, meaning they're targeted by any potential enemy, meaning if there's any threat, even threat warning of potential nuclear war, there's a strong temptation to send them off. It's use them or lose them, it's called. That greatly enhances the threat of nuclear war. Everyone knows it, but they keep expanding them. In fact, they're being expanded right now over the advice of just about every strategic analyst. And it's done for crass political reasons. Some congressman in a rural state wants the emplacement in his state because you pick up a couple of jobs and a little bit of profit from businesses that way. So let's destroy ourselves. Now, this is happening on every front. It takes you're right to point out to the military emissions, but a lot more happened at Glasgow, which is quite intriguing. So, for example, there was a lot of excitement about the fact that the big financial institutions, BlackRock, all these guys, said that we have $130 trillion that we're ready to put into dealing with global warming. And John Kerry, the U.S. negotiator was ecstatic that we finally have the magic of the market working for us. How can we lose? The market, the holy market, is going to work for us. $130 trillion for deal with global warming, until you start reading the footnotes. We will use the $130 trillion if we are guaranteed that there's no risk by the international financial institutions. So we'll do it the way the market actually works, not the market that they teach you about in Econ 101, but the actual market, the bailout economy, the one where business wants to be sure that the poor and the working people suffer the ravages of the market, but they are protected. They're protected by not only bailouts, but by an implicit government insurance policy. In the case of Larry Fink and BlackRock, by a guarantee that it'll be riskless. We only make profit. We can't lose anything. That market we now have on our side, and we know how that market works. Okay, these things are just kind of under the radar. This one was actually pointed out in a good analysis by a very fine political economist, Adam Tooze, in the British press. But that's the kind of thing you have to look for. So yes, military missions are important. Kerry's excitement about the magic of the market turns out to be the real life market, not the imaginary one.
Also, the scary thing about BlackRock is they are the top shareholder in Shell. And while they are clearly part of the problem, they have presented themselves as the solution. But when we look at the fire at Grenfell Tower in London, we see that the cladding and the insulation was applied to the building off the back of Kyoto agreements and the government's obligation to lower carbon emission. And what happened was you had Brofuma, which was an insulation lobby, basically get the government to subsidize them insulating buildings. The problem is that companies like Arconic, who put the cladding on Grenfell with 6 millimeters of polyethylene in the middle of it, its top shareholder is also BlackRock. And of course, they put essentially solidified petrol on the side of this building. And now we have a crisis across the country where hospitals, hotels, cinemas, schools, and by some estimates, about 1 million leaseholders are now trapped in flats which they can't sell, which they're expected to still pay a mortgage for, which have flammable solidified petrol insulation on the side of it. So in a situation where neoliberalism has, climate change is one of the ways in which neoliberalism kills people. Deregulated building construction industry is another way in which neoliberalism kills people. When our situation is as deregulated as this, when there are those that say the Green New Deal will require a huge amount of lithium extraction. Extraction is responsible for 50% of carbon emissions. When the situation is as deregulated as this is, what can we expect?
Well, if we let the institutional structures function freely, we can expect disaster. Unregulated capitalism is a suicide pact. That's been understood by the business world for hundreds of years. They've never accepted capitalism. They've always demanded a powerful state to intervene in their interests. That's as old as capitalism. It goes back to Adam Smith. He pointed out that what he called the masters of mankind, his day, that was the merchants and manufacturers of England. They make sure that they control government policy, and they ensure that the actions of government are that, as he put it, their own interests are most peculiarly attended to. In other words, we get what we want from the actions of government, which we control. And then he added, however grievous the effects may be on the people of England, and of course, their victims elsewhere. That's 1776. Not a new insight. That's the way the institutions function. They will never permit capitalism. They'll never permit markets because they're too destructive, and they know it. So they want to control the institutions of power in their own interests. Take a look at what's called neoliberalism, what we've been subjected to for the last 45 years or so, Reagan, Thatcher, basically. You look the word up in the dictionary, sounds very nice. Market principles, everyone has a fair chance, etc., etc. You look at the practices of neoliberalism, bitter, unremitting class war, and it shows up in the outcomes. So just to give one example, the Rand Corporation, super respectable, tried to do a study of what they call the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population to the very top, actually a fraction of 1%, during the past 40 years. Their estimate is roughly on the order of $50 trillion from the poor and the working class, large part of the middle class, to the super rich. Well, that's class war. Deregulation is part of it. You read an economics text, says deregulation is great. It leads to more competition. Turn to the real world, better for consumers and so on. Go to the real world, it leads to monopolization because the big fish eat the little ones. Right now, for example, just to make it personal, for about 2 months, my wife has been trying to get a badly needed upgrade on our internet. Good luck. Let's see if you can get through the recorded phone calls and the missed appointments and this and that, which you can do if you have a virtual monopoly, especially when you have a state that's trying desperately to prevent economic development. So we happen to be in away from the town center where you don't have high-grade internet. You have it in the business center, but go 10 miles outside, you lost it. You could make a deal with China to get high-grade Huawei 5G internet. Not allowed to do that. We have to punish ourselves because you're not allowed to deal with those terrible yellow people over there. I mean, actually, there's a pretty interesting article in the New York Times this morning by Benjamin Applebaum, good economist, who reviews the effect of Trump's tariffs in the last, during his 4 years, extended by Biden. Turns out, as any reasonable person would assume, and as many economists pointed out, that they're paid for by Americans. And in fact, now they're paid for by the global economy as he goes through the production of chassis for trucks. Not allowed to get cheap Chinese ones that might help China develop. So therefore, we have to get American ones, except they're not produced here. Or if they are, they're too expensive. So therefore, you have supply line crashes because ships are standing outside the Los Angeles harbor and there's no trucks to move the commodities. But yes, we hurt China a lot. Yeah.
I also remember your appearance on The Firing Line with William Buckley, when he, in a sort of a veiled threat, he said that if you lost your temper, he would smash you in the goddamn face. Looking at William Buckley, it's quite interesting because in the 1950s, he actually worked as an undercover agent for the CIA. What is the extent to the revolving door between the intelligence services in the United States and the media today?
Well, there were exposés in the 60s of large-scale CIA penetration of media. It came out in Ramparts, left-wing journal, and got investigated and so on. I don't know if there's anything like that now, and I frankly don't think it's needed because the shared assumptions are so overwhelming that it's probably not needed. Buckley didn't need a CIA connection to have his beliefs. In fact, he probably went well to the right of the CIA, which tends to be moderately liberal sometimes. I think the real issue is the set of shared assumptions of intellectual, political, cultural elites. They don't vary very much, somewhat. In fact, a long time ago, I think it might have been C. Wright Mills back in the 50s, said that the United States is a single-party state, the business party, with two factions, Democrats and Republicans. Back in those days, they were not that different. Now they're pretty different. The Democrats have moved slightly to the right, but the Republicans have gone way off the spectrum. They're not a political party in the sense of parliamentary democracies anymore. Sometimes the shamelessness is almost indescribable. Like, you probably followed Kevin McCarthy's long discourse to try to hold up the Biden bill. I think he talked for 8 hours. One of the things he said was charging Biden for failure to deal with the COVID crisis, the pandemic. This is the spokesman for the party that has been doing everything they can to make it worse, blocking mandates, blocking, claiming that it doesn't exist, arguing you don't have to have vaccines. Barely a majority of Republicans have been vaccinated. So first, what we do is devote all our efforts to making the pandemic much worse. Then we blame somebody else for the fact that it's not under control. This is carrying shamelessness to an indescribable degree. Not the first time. The most striking case, which was barely commented on, is what happened with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Trump arranged the withdrawal, worst possible way. Total lack of concern for Afghans. Told the Taliban, do whatever you like, no conditions. Just don't shoot at Americans. Anything else is okay. You look at the Republican Party. This was hailed as a magnificent achievement by our amazing genius leader. It was featured on their webpage. In fact, they kept it featured on their webpage until the debacle, when Biden pursued a actually better version of what they'd been hailing, and it turned into a predictable disaster. At that point, they took it off their webpage and started denouncing the Democrats and even the generals for carrying out what Trump had arranged. I mean, this is not a political party anymore. It's just a gang of out of control. I don't know don't want to use the word. You make it up.
Well, I mean, here we have someone that Trump quite proudly described as Britain Trump. I'm not sure exactly if his grammar was correct, but Boris Johnson, as a peddler in the same way Trump was, of horizontal hatred and vertical solidarity, we have seen the scapegoating of refugees and migrants in the same way that the Trump administration and seemingly consecutive US administrations have done in at least policy, from a policy perspective. But today we have seen at least 30 people drown in the English Channel trying to reach this country. What is your analysis or estimation of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson?
Boris Johnson is not my favorite character. In fact, his treatment of refugees, regrettably, is that of the entire European Union. European Union crimes against refugees make what Trump did look mild. It's much worse. It's one of the worst crimes of the modern age. I mean, there are thousands of people dying in the Mediterranean trying to flee from Africa, where Europe has a certain history, destroyed Africa for centuries. People are trying to flee from the wreckage. The Europeans are saying, go drown in the Mediterranean. In fact, Europe is in the poorest country of Africa, Niger. Europe has set up military bases to try to assist the Niger security forces to prevent Africans from getting anywhere near the Mediterranean. Don't come anywhere near us. We destroy you for a couple hundred years. We enslave your male, female, your able-bodied population, destroy you. We prevent you from developing. We murder and slaughter you, but don't come anywhere near our shores. Okay? I don't think there are words to describe this. It's beyond my capacity to describe. It's a hideous crime. What the United States is doing is bad enough. Not far from where I live, incidentally. I live about 70 or 80 miles from the southern border. You go into the harsh, very harsh desert right between where I live and the border. There's corpses of people fleeing from the wreckage that we created when we destroyed their countries and are still doing. And you have a border, but there are people, very good people, and right here in Tucson, where I live, who go out into the desert. It is very harsh. Temperature can be 120 degrees, very harsh brush. Clinton purposely closed off the points of easy access where people could ask for asylum to drive them into the harshest, most forbidding areas. They still flee. And, then there could be helicopters flying over them to scatter them so that they get lost in the desert and die. There are border patrols that come by to destroy water bottles that are left by citizens trying to help them. The whole thing is so, at the concentration camps for children, the whole thing is a horror story. And of course, it's going to get much worse as the climate crisis increases. Refugee flow is going to escalate exponentially. Places like South Asia are going to be literally unlivable if we continue in our present course. Same with much of the Middle East. It's a huge disaster now, much more coming. And it's known, and nobody's doing anything about it, except the good people who are going out to try to help them and rescue them, which shows that there is something in the human character that could save us, same as the kids on the street in Glasgow. That's the hope.
In this context, very popular US writer, I won't put it any stronger than that, Jordan Peterson, has described racism or thinking about racism as low resolution thinking. He's also described the university as being in the thralls of a sort of woke dictatorship of leftists dominating these institutions, as if McCarthyism never happened, as if the spy ops infiltration of 1,000 political groups in this country, 99% of them being of the left, including the National Union of Students, including the National Union of Teachers, as if none of this happened at all. What is your estimation of Jordan Peterson's ideas?
Well, Peterson is correct from his point of view, but you have to understand that for him, anything to the left of Attila the Hun is left. So yes, in other words, anybody who has one spark of decency, the minimal concern for other people, willingness to pay the slightest attention to the facts, is a leftist totalitarian. So it's true that they've taken over everything. But this is where he gets his cult following from. I don't understand. If you want a good analysis of him, the best one I've seen is by Nathan Robinson in his journal, Current Affairs, has a very careful, astute analysis of the Peterson cult and what keeps it going. But the fact of the matter is that the universities tend to be, by international standards, basically middle of the road, mildly conservative. We have to understand that what's called left in the United States is called right in other countries. Take, for example, what's being debated in Congress right now, maternity leave. The United States is joined by half a dozen Pacific islands in lacking paid maternity leave. They go to Brazil, the next largest country in the hemisphere, hardly a leftist paradise. 4 months of paid maternity leave, 2 months more optional under Social Security. Plenty of countries have paternity leave, not the United States. Almost every country has paid vacations, a month or more, not the United States. In fact, one of the editors of the Financial Times, the world's leading business journal, London, quipped a while back that if Bernie Sanders was running in Germany, he could be running on the right-wing Christian Democrat program, which in fact is true. His main themes, universal health care, free higher education, have them in Germany, have them everywhere, have them in Mexico, just here. So what's called too radical for the American people is supported by right-wing parties elsewhere. So from that perspective, you can call the universities left, namely most of the faculty is probably mainstream Democrat, Clinton, Obama, Democrats, center-right, call that left. But by U.S. standards, that's left.
You've also gone on record making the point that the toxic legacy and cancer rates in Fallujah are worse than those in Hiroshima. Can you explain that for us, please?
Well, I don't remember the exact words, but there is a definite toxic legacy using poisoned weapons and so on. There have been studies, for example, of some of the major battlefields like Fallujah with a very high incident of cancer. We don't have a real estimate because we don't investigate our own crimes. We investigate the crimes of enemies with intensive detail. So you want to study Srebrenica, you can, every small piece of bone that anybody could dig up is investigated. When it comes to our crimes, not allowed to investigate them. Clinton, for example, blocked investigation of the East Timor crimes, which are apparently the worst since Second World War. We supported them all the way. killed a third of the population. When they finally had liberty, they wanted to investigate deaths during the last paroxysm of atrocities. Clinton stopped it. When we bombed the Al-Shifa, the pharmaceutical plant, produced half the pharmaceuticals for a poor country that couldn't replenish them. Nobody knows the cost. Clinton barred investigation. In fact, we don't even know the number of people killed in Vietnam because we don't investigate it. How many people are victims of our chemical warfare in Vietnam? Well, we have some measure for American veterans, not much, nothing for the Vietnamese. That's not our business. We're just in the business of killing, poisoning, not reckoning what happened. And we're following an ancient script. Britain never investigated its atrocities. France never investigated them. Only defeated countries have to investigate them, not the victors. They can pretend it didn't happen.
As we know, China today is surrounded by about 400 US military bases. There seems to be an escalation over the South China Sea. Could you give us your analysis of that situation?
Well, that's a very interesting situation. The United States, first of all, with regard to the law, China is violating international law in the South China Sea. They are violating a judgment of an international tribunal that opposed to their fortifying small islands. They're tiny islands. But the United States is not in a very strong position to complain about that because the United States is the only maritime power which refused even to ratify the law of the sea. So we have no standing. There are problems in the South China Sea, and they should be dealt with by diplomacy and negotiations with the regional powers in the lead. The United States has no business there. It's now sending naval armadas into the South China Sea as a provocative action. Britain, the vassal of the United States, is following along obediently and doing it as well. The United States and Britain just made a deal with Australia to supply Australia with a fleet of nuclear submarines, vastly enhancing the threat to China. China has about 4 old, noisy diesel submarines in the South China Sea, its main maritime area to reach the outside world. So we have to send Australia nuclear submarines to enhance the threat while we're sending naval armadas, always talking about the Great China threat. I should say that these submarines, they do not even have a strategic purpose. They're there for intimidation. They're not even going to be operative for about 15 years. By that time, of course, China will have built up its defenses to counter them, which just increases the level of threat and provocation. Same when Britain sends a aircraft carrier in to try to pretend that it's still a major power and follow the bidding of the United States. The claim of the United States is that we have to preserve freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation doesn't even arise. There is absolutely no threat to freedom of navigation. None has been posed, none has been implemented. What's going on is a technicality in the law of the sea, which the U.S. has not ratified. But let's put that aside. There is a law of the sea. One of its provisions is to provide every maritime country with a 200-mile economic exclusion zone, EEZ, every country, maritime country. There's a question what outside operations are allowed in the EEZs. The United States claims that military and intelligence operations are permitted in them. China says no. He says freedom of navigation, but no military intelligence operations. China is incidentally joined by India, which recently strongly objected to U.S. military intelligence operations in its economic zone. Well, there's an obvious case for diplomacy and negotiations. That's all that's at stake. You look at the wording of the law of the sea, it says in the EEZs, there can be no foreign threat or use of force. So it's a question how to interpret those words. Are military operations a threat of force? U.S. says no, China and India say yes. That's the issue. Okay? Is the answer to that issue sending in a naval armada and creating a nuclear submarines, supplying nuclear submarines? In fact, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Paul Keating, who's a highly regarded international statesman, he had a recent article in the Australian press. It says right in the claw of the dragon, the ones who are supposedly endangered. He asked, what is the China threat? He was criticizing the nuclear submarine deal. He says, we don't want this, it just endangers us. And then he says, what is the threat of China? It's a question that's very rarely asked. We just scream about it, but what is it? And he runs through the various arguments, shows that they're nonsense, and he concludes what I think is correct. The threat of China is China's existence. It exists as a major power which the United States cannot push around and cannot intimidate and does not follow U.S. orders. That's intolerable. Any mafia don can explain that. So Europe is okay because Europe follows U.S. orders. When the United States imposes vicious, murderous sanctions on Iran, Europe objects, but it abides by them because you don't step on the toes of the godfather. He's dangerous, seriously dangerous, not just military force. U.S. can throw anybody out of the international financial system, which the U.S. runs. So you don't offend the godfather. Take a look at the UN votes on the Cuba blockade, 184-2, United States and Israel. Israel has to vote with the United States. So it basically unanimously opposed the United States. Everyone abides by the blockade, not China. Can't intimidate them. That's unacceptable. So we have to destroy them to prevent them from developing, to try to undermine their economy, to send nuclear submarines to threaten them, because they exist. And you cannot tolerate defiance. That's a major principle of international affairs. That Britain acted the same way when it was running the world. France in its smaller domains, that's imperial power. For the United States, it's basically the world. The U.S. has the kind of imperial power that had never existed before.
No, you may not have been aware of it, but at one point during the campaign against Corbyn, you were very unfairly folded into it when a key antagonist of Jeremy Corbyn actually ridiculously asserted that you were a promoter of anti-Semitism. Her name, Rachel Riley, a TV celebrity in this country. Do you have any response to Rachel Riley and this ridiculous assertion?
Well, I think from a certain point of view, the charge is correct. The point of view was explained by Abba Eban, the highly praised, regarded Israeli at that time foreign minister, Israeli diplomat, very much loved and honored in the West, mainly because he had a nice Oxford accent. So he was a real gentleman. But back in 1972, he wrote an important article. It's worth reading. It was an article in the liberal American Zionist press, the American press of the American Jewish Congress, which is the more liberal Jewish organization. It's called Congress Weekly. I think it was 1972. Very important article. He was instructing American Jews on their duty, their responsibility. He said, your responsibility is to show that any critique of Zionism, by which he meant the policies of his government, any critique of those policies, if it comes from a non-Jew, is anti-Semitism. If it comes from a Jew, it's Jewish self-hatred. And he gave, so it's 100%. He gave two examples of what he called neurotic Jewish self-hatred. One was I.F. Stone, who was a strong supporter of Israel, but critical of its policies. The other, I'm proud to say, was me. So I'm consumed by neurotic Jewish self-hatred. That's why I criticize Israeli crimes. But Evan's point is 100% of any criticism of Israel is either anti-Semitism or neurotic Jewish self-hatred, which we can get rid of. So that commentator was actually correct. Since every criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, can't criticize it. And if you criticize it, you're a Holocaust denier. If you oppose Israel's invasion of Gaza, where it destroys the place, kills thousands of people, you're a Holocaust denier. It follows directly. So there's a certain logic to it. And the attack on Corbyn from that point of view was correct. He did speak up for Palestinian rights. So he's an anti-Semite. Because how can you claim any rights for people who Israel's crushing under its jackboot? Can't do that. It's anti-Semitism. But Evan is not from the right, incidentally. He's speaking from the left liberal side of the Zionist movement. His government at that time was the Labour government, the Golda Meir government.
Noam, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate you taking this time to speak to us today. Until next time on The Watchdog, this is Lowkey. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.